In this video, we're going to look at some of the common controls between different types of compressors that we'll see when we're using different plugins. Now, we've already mentioned a few of the controls that we'll see, such as threshold, attack, and release. Let's take a look at 4 different plugins and see what kind of controls they have so we can discuss what's going to be most common and what we need to learn about first. Let's look at this Waves compressor. We have the C1 comp. The very first thing we see on the left-hand side is a couple of meters. On the left-hand side of these 2 meters, we see the gain reduction meter. Now, it can go down below 0 for compression or above 0 for expansion. For the moment, we'll just be dealing with compression. To the right of that, we have our threshold slider, which corresponds to this numerical value here, as well as this slider here, but the meter on the left-hand side of the plugin here gives us a visual volume reference with which to set our threshold. We also see the same sort of volume reference here in our main screen. To the next section, we see that the first control is reference. We have low reference or peak reference. Low reference refers to RMS, or a method of detection that we've discussed earlier, and peak reference refers to peak detection reference. Next, we have makeup gain, which is measured as well in a numerical value. Then we have our threshold, the ability to set our ratio, our attack, release, and something called PDR. Now, in this particular plugin, PDR stands for Program Dependent Release, and basically it's the equivalent of auto release on other plugins that we'll see later. We have our main compression section, which gives us reference for both our audio on the vertical axes and our gain reduction on the horizontal axes. We have our output section, where we can adjust the gain post-compression and monitor to make sure that we're not clipping. Let's go ahead and play some audio and watch this compressor in action. Now, I have more tracks enabled than just the tracks that are going through this particular compressor, so we're just going to watch how this compressor does its actions and not actually listen for the changes that it makes. So what we see is that our threshold, represented in decibels below 0, is represented here on the vertical axis. If I lower my threshold, then I'm lowering the overall top point of this visual representation. As the gain reduction happens, we see a little bar move across the threshold and go downwards. That represents how much gain reduction is actually happening at that moment. If the bar sits about here, then we're at negative 30 decibels of gain reduction because we're between 20 and 40 here on the grid. We can go all the way down to 100, which would probably be very quiet, but the visual representation allows us to go down that far. Remember that makeup gain and output gain here are not the same. Output gain allows us to do stuff after the makeup gain of the compressor, and different compressor plugins are going to have different levels of saturation or coloration that you may or may not want. Next, let's look at Logic's included compressor here. We have a few similar controls and a few controls that are differently named, but essentially the same. First, at the top, we have our circuit type and sidechain detection. Now, we haven't yet talked about sidechain detection or the different compression algorithms, but these settings are used for the way that we route the compressor here on sidechain detection and the kind of compressor that this plugin is trying to emulate here under circuit type. We have a gain reduction meter that starts at 0 on the right and goes to negative 50 on the left. We have knobs for attack and release corresponding to what we've seen before, but this time, instead of PDR or program dependent release, we just have a button that says auto. We also have settings for threshold, makeup gain, and our limiter threshold, and a button to enable our limiter circuit. We can choose to do auto makeup gain with this here, and we can control where our peaks are going to be after the auto makeup gain does its work. They can be at 0 dB or at negative 12 dB, depending on the calibration of your particular song. We have our detection method here, which can either be peak or RMS, and this is going to change depending on the type of compressor that we want to emulate, but in the Platinum algorithm, we have both available, and it's either one or the other. We have knee, which is the control over the amount of compression that kicks in before the threshold. At a very hard knee, we get no compression before the threshold. And at a very soft knee, we get compression leading up to the threshold. This is something that we'll discuss more in depth later, but it's a control that we haven't seen thus far. Next, we have our ratio, and of course, the ubiquitous visual compression meter, with the threshold being represented on the vertical scale and the amount of gain reduction being represented on the horizontal scale. So let's play some audio. Remember that this compressor is on the overhead track, so that's what's going to trigger this particular compressor. We'll play the audio and see how this compressor does its job. Right away, we can see some similarities between Logic's included compressor and the Waves C1 compressor. We have the same essential set of settings. Everything here is related to either the detection circuit or the gain reduction circuit. And we have the same overall visual interface as well as slider-based control over our threshold and output gain. The inclusion here is the limiter, which is actually just a very specific type of compressor that we'll discuss later. So moving along, let's look at the next compressor. I have the Synopsis Sv 315. Right away, we can see that there are some similarities in the graphical interface here. We have the same threshold on the vertical scale and gain reduction on the horizontal scale, as well as the gain reduction meter here. But we also have some new controls that we haven't experienced before. Just up above, we have an input trim pot. The input trim pot can control the audio level coming in before the compressor. We can either reduce the level or raise the level independently. To the right, we have our typical ratio, threshold, and knee, as well as an option for auto makeup gain. But in this case, we see a new control called crush. In a lot of classic hardware compressors, there's a point at which the audio will distort. At a certain level of compression, we are inducing distortion. In the case of the Synopsis compressor, the crush knob controls that point where the saturation will induce. The lower the crush knob is set, the lower the point of saturation for that particular compressor. At 100% crush, we'll get pure compression with no saturation, and that's considered a little bit more modern of an effect. Next, we see our typical attack and release knobs with the same auto release option that we had before. We also see a knob for switching between two different types of compression circuits included in the SV315 and a knob for hold that's enabled when we use the auto release mode. When we're using the auto release mode, the hold knob provides some additional compression shaping only relative to the auto release mechanism. If we turn it off, our release is only shaped by our release knob here. Just below the attack and release section, we see a limiter section. It's got its own threshold, an independent gain reduction light, and two buttons, one for routing the audio signal into the limiter, and one to choose between a fast and slow response. To the left of that, we have our sidechain section. Now, sidechain, as you may remember, is equivalent to detection circuit. So we have 4 filter options to place on our detection circuit. These will shape the sound that the compressor is listening to, not the sound that you're playing, but what the actual compressor is using to determine when the compression should be applied. In this plugin, there are 4 different filter shapes that will weight the frequency response one way or another to determine how the compressor is going to act, as well as a button to enable the external sidechain, which is a process that we'll have to discuss a little later. So let's compare the common controls so far. On every compressor that we've seen, we see a few key things. We have a gain reduction meter, some way to look at how much gain reduction we're applying. We have our threshold, our ratio. On some compressors, we have a knee, and auto makeup gain. And on every compressor, we have attack and release settings, and even on a few of them, an option for a limiter. Generally speaking, we're going to have a visual reference for our output gain, as well as a way to adjust the gain coming in and out of the compressor. In the case of the 315, we have the input trim pot and the output volume knob. So we've still got another compressor to look at. Here I have the Tirax Cl Compressor, or the classic compressor. And we see a lot of the same settings, just in different places that we've seen before on the other compressors. Starting from the left-hand side, we have a sidechain high-pass filter, which is equivalent to the 315's sidechain filter section. It just acts a different way that's specific to this plugin. We have our typical attack and release times, as well as our ratio. But this time, we don't see a threshold. We're using a fixed threshold compressor, which means that that threshold is set internally. So here, we control input drive, and that will drive the audio further or closer to the threshold. Above that, we have a knob for stereo enhancement, which is something that's unique to the Tirax Cl compressor. We, of course, have our output gain to control makeup gain after the fact. So when we're using a fixed threshold compressor, we're probably not going to see things like threshold or knee, and we're probably not going to see things like auto release either, because most fixed threshold compressors are designed to emulate classic pieces of gear. Here we also have the option to reset our compression settings and bypass the plugin altogether, separately of our bypass modes in our particular DAW. In addition to the differences in controls on a fixed threshold compressor, a lot of times we're going to see the visual elements of the compressor hark back to classic compression units as well, such as here, instead of having the more technical threshold on the vertical, gain reduction on the horizontal type of interface, we just see one VU meter with a little pin that represents our overall level of gain reduction. Now I'm going to play some audio and we'll see how this differs from the other compressors. Since the only element that we're measuring here is gain reduction, all we see is little blips in the VU meter towards the left-hand side when the gain is being reduced by the compression circuit. We have no way of monitoring our input or output gain or where our threshold is at that particular time. So the Tirax Cl compressor kind of relies on us knowing what we're doing and using our ears to measure the compression rather than more scientific methods like some of the other compressors allow. So now we've looked at 4 radically different compressors, and we can see the types of common controls in all of these compressors. We always have control over our ratio, and we'll almost always have control over our attack and release time, as well as some way to interact with the threshold. On some compressors, we'll be able to adjust the threshold manually using a slider or a numerical value with a graphical representation, and on some compressors, like the CL here, the threshold is fixed, and we interact with that threshold by adjusting our input gain and then using the output gain knob to control our makeup gain. Some compressors have auto release, some have auto makeup gain to make things easier, but for the most part, every control that we see has something to do with the detection circuit or the gain circuit. As we've said many times before, all compressors can be broken down to these 2 essential elements, and every control that we're going to see has something to do with either the way the compressor hears the sound or the way the compressor affects the sound. In the next few videos, we're going to learn more about the relationship between the individual controls, starting with threshold and ratio. Thanks for watching.